Laughter came before Elvis Presley touched a single key. It began as a joke, a harmless line from Johnny Carson. A few words thrown across a brightly lit television stage while cameras rolled and millions of people watched from their homes. But before the night was over, that laughter would disappear. The orchestra would fall silent. The audience would rise from their seats. And Johnny Carson, the man who had laughed the loudest, would stand beside a piano with tears running down his face. Because Elvis Presley was about to do something no one in that studio expected. And it would begin with one simple sentence. "You'll never play the piano." The Tonight Show studio was glowing beneath the heat of the lights. Every seat was filled. The audience had come expecting another night of laughter, interviews, music, and surprises. Johnny Carson sat comfortably behind his desk, smiling as the applause rolled through the room. The orchestra waited nearby. Everything was perfectly prepared. Then Johnny turned toward the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Elvis Presley." The audience exploded. Elvis walked into the light as cheers thundered from every corner of the studio. He waved politely, smiled, shook Johnny's hand, but there was something different about him that night. He seemed unusually quiet. His eyes moved briefly toward the far side of the stage, toward a magnificent black grand piano. Johnny noticed, and immediately a mischievous smile appeared on his face. "Wait a minute," Johnny said. The audience quieted. Elvis turned back toward him. Johnny pointed at the piano. "Are you planning on playing that tonight?" Elvis smiled faintly. "Maybe." The audience laughed. Johnny leaned back. "Maybe?" He looked toward the crowd. "Now, I've heard Elvis sing." The audience applauded. "I've heard Elvis perform." More applause. "I've even heard stories about him doing things nobody else can do on a stage." The audience laughed. Then Johnny slowly looked toward the piano again. "But play the piano?" He shook his head. The laughter began. "Elvis, I don't think you could sit down at that piano and play a real song if your life depended on it." The studio erupted. Johnny laughed with them. Even a few musicians smiled. Elvis remained standing, quiet. Johnny continued. "Maybe we should leave that job to the professionals." Another wave of laughter rolled through the audience. For several seconds, Elvis said nothing. The cameras moved closer, and suddenly, the room began to notice his silence. Johnny was still smiling, but Elvis wasn't. He wasn't angry. He wasn't embarrassed. His expression had simply changed. He looked toward the piano, then slowly turned back toward Johnny. "Johnny," the host raised an eyebrow. "Yes?" Elvis gave a small smile. "I learned something a long time ago." The laughter faded. Johnny folded his hands. "And what was that?" Elvis looked at the black piano. "Never argue with a man who's waiting to see you fail." The entire studio went silent. Johnny's smile weakened. Elvis continued. "Sometimes," he paused, "you let the music answer for you." The audience suddenly erupted. Applause exploded across the room, but Elvis didn't move. He waited. The applause slowly faded again. Then he looked toward the orchestra. No band. The musicians stared at him. Johnny leaned forward. Elvis continued. No help. A strange silence fell across the stage. Johnny's expression changed. He had expected Elvis to laugh, to make a joke, maybe sit down and play a few simple notes. But now something felt different. "Hold on," Johnny said. "You're serious?" Elvis nodded. Johnny looked at the orchestra, then back at Elvis. "You haven't rehearsed this." "No. You're really going to do it alone?" Elvis smiled. "That's what you wanted, isn't it?" The audience reacted with nervous laughter. Johnny pointed toward him. "Now don't blame me if this goes badly." Elvis looked toward the piano again. "I won't." And then he began walking. One step, then another. His shoes clicked softly against the polished studio floor. The cameras followed him. The audience watched without speaking. Elvis reached the piano and placed his hand on its smooth black surface. For a moment, he stood completely still. Then his fingers slowly moved across the edge of the instrument. And something changed in his face. The confident superstar seemed to disappear. The bright lights disappeared. The cameras disappeared. The millions watching disappeared. For one brief moment, Elvis looked like a man standing somewhere far away, somewhere in his past. A small room, an old piano, the sound of music coming from a church. A young boy listening to melodies and dreaming about a life nobody around him could yet see. Johnny noticed the change, and for the first time that night, he stopped smiling. Elvis pulled out the bench. The sound echoed softly through the silent studio. He sat down, slowly, carefully. Then he placed both hands above the keys. But he did not play. Not yet. His eyes lowered. The audience waited. 1 second, then another, then another. Johnny looked toward the orchestra as if expecting someone to begin. Nobody moved. There would be no rescue, no drums, no strings, no trumpet section, no backup singer, just Elvis and the piano. Finally, one finger touched a key. A single note floated through the studio. Soft, gentle, almost fragile. The audience leaned forward. Another note followed. Then another. The beginning of a melody slowly appeared. At first, it was simple. So simple that nobody knew what to think. Johnny sat back in his chair. His eyes remained fixed on Elvis. Elvis continued. His fingers moved again. The melody became warmer, deeper. One phrase answered another. The piano began to sound less like an instrument and more like a memory. Then Elvis took a breath and began to sing. His voice entered quietly. Not with the power of a stadium performance. Not with the wild energy people expected from Elvis Presley. This voice was different. It was softer, closer. It sounded like he wasn't singing to the audience. It sounded like he was singing to someone who was no longer there. The camera moved closer. A woman in the front row slowly placed her hand over her mouth. Johnny's eyes narrowed. The joke was gone now. Completely gone. Elvis continued singing. His fingers moved carefully across the keys. Every note had space around it. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was covered by an orchestra. If he made a mistake, everyone would hear it. If his voice trembled, everyone would know. He had nowhere to hide. And somehow, that made the performance even more powerful. Johnny looked around the room. Hundreds of people had been laughing only minutes earlier. Now nobody spoke. One of the orchestra musicians lowered his head. Another stared toward Elvis without moving. The music continued. And with every passing moment, it seemed as though Elvis was becoming more deeply connected to something the audience could not see. A memory, a promise, a wound, something old, something he had carried for years. Then his voice suddenly changed. It grew stronger. The piano followed. The melody began to rise. The audience felt it immediately. A woman near the aisle wiped her eyes. Someone whispered Elvis's name. Johnny sat completely still. And then Elvis reached a line that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than rehearsal. His voice trembled, only slightly. But enough. Enough for Johnny Carson to notice. Enough to make the room feel as though they had accidentally been allowed into a private moment. Elvis stopped singing. The audience held its breath, but his hands continued playing. The piano grew louder. The melody climbed. His fingers moved with greater confidence, and suddenly, the quiet man sitting at the piano disappeared. The music exploded, not with noise, but with emotion. A powerful sequence of notes thundered through the studio. Several people gasped. Johnny slowly stood from his chair. The audience watched in disbelief. This was not a joke anymore. This was not Elvis proving he could play a few notes. Something else was happening. Something nobody had prepared for. Then Elvis suddenly stopped. Silence crashed into the studio. His hands remained above the keys, his head lowered, and Johnny, standing beside his desk, stared toward the piano. For one long moment, nobody knew whether the song was over. Then Elvis quietly said, "This next part." The entire studio leaned closer. He swallowed. "It was written for someone I promised I would never forget." Johnny's face changed. The audience became absolutely silent. Elvis looked down at the keys, and for the first time that night, his eyes seemed filled with pain. He took a slow breath, then whispered, "Johnny, I wasn't planning to play this." Nobody moved. "But your joke reminded me of something." Johnny stared at him. Elvis placed his fingers back on the piano. "Sometimes people laugh because they don't know what a person has been carrying." Johnny's eyes began to soften. Elvis looked toward him. "And sometimes, the music is the only place you can finally put it down." The studio fell completely still. Then Elvis pressed the first key, and the melody that came next was unlike anything anyone in that room had heard before. But what Johnny Carson discovered about that song just moments later would leave him unable to stop crying. And before we continue, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? If you believe that music can carry memories that words can never explain, like this video, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe for more powerful legendary stories. Because what Elvis was about to reveal was not just about proving Johnny Carson wrong. It was about a promise, a memory, and a person whose name had been connected to that piano melody for years. Elvis closed his eyes. His hands began to move. And Johnny Carson suddenly realized he was about to hear a secret Elvis had never intended to reveal on live television.
Elvis pressed the first key, and the entire studio disappeared. At least, that was how it felt. The bright lights were still burning above the stage. The cameras were still rolling. Hundreds of people were still sitting in the audience, while millions watched from their homes. But nobody seemed to remember any of that anymore. There was only the piano, only Elvis, and a melody filled with a sadness so deep that even the people who had never met him could feel that something inside the song had been broken long before this night began. Johnny Carson remained standing beside his desk. He didn't sit down. He couldn't. Only minutes earlier, he had laughed. He had pointed at the piano and joked that Elvis Presley would never play a real song. Now Johnny watched the man in front of him with a completely different expression. Because Elvis was no longer performing, he was remembering. The melody moved slowly through the studio. One note, then another. Each one seemed to carry a memory. Elvis's head remained lowered. His fingers crossed the keys with a strange mixture of confidence and hesitation, as though part of him knew exactly where the music was going, while another part was afraid to follow it. Johnny finally stepped away from his desk. Very slowly, he moved closer to the stage. The audience noticed, but nobody said a word. Elvis continued playing. Then, quietly, Johnny asked, "Who was it for?" Elvis did not stop. The question hung in the air. For several seconds, only the piano answered. Then Elvis spoke. Someone who believed in me before I had anything to prove. The audience became even quieter. Johnny's face changed. Elvis took a breath. I was young. His fingers continued moving. Young enough to think a dream was all a person needed. A faint smile appeared on his face, then disappeared. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I sang loud enough, if I gave everything I had, someday the world would have to listen. Johnny watched him carefully. And did they? Elvis gave a quiet laugh. Eventually. The audience smiled softly. But Elvis's expression remained distant. He continued, "Before any of that happened, there was a man who used to tell me something." His right hand played a soft line across the higher keys. His left hand remained deep and steady. He said, "Don't be afraid when people laugh at you." Johnny slowly lowered his eyes. Elvis noticed, but he continued. He said, "People laugh at dreams when they can't see them yet." The room was silent. Elvis played another phrase. Then one day, if you survive long enough to make those dreams real, those same people will tell you they always knew you could do it. A few people in the audience laughed gently, but Johnny did not. Something in his expression had changed again. Elvis looked toward him. "That man taught me how to sit at a piano." Johnny's eyes widened. The audience murmured. Elvis's hands slowed. "Not like a teacher." He shook his head. "He wasn't a famous musician." The melody softened. "He couldn't read a room full of notes. He didn't know anything about fame." Johnny took another step closer. "Then who was he?" Elvis stopped playing. The silence was immediate. His fingers rested above the keys. For the first time since he had begun, Elvis looked directly at Johnny Carson. A man named Samuel. Nobody recognized the name. That made it even more mysterious. Elvis looked back down. "He lived near us when I was a boy." The camera moved closer. "He had an old, upright piano." Elvis smiled faintly. "Old is probably too kind a word for it." A quiet laugh moved through the audience. It was missing a few keys. The wood was scratched. Half the time it sounded like it was ready to fall apart. Johnny smiled through the emotion in his eyes. "But Samuel loved that piano." Elvis nodded. "He said every instrument has a story." Elvis played a single low note. Even the broken ones. The note seemed to stay in the room. Especially the broken ones. Nobody spoke. Elvis continued, "I used to visit him whenever I could. I'd sit beside him while he played." His voice became softer. "And every time I tried to touch the keys, I was terrible." The audience laughed gently. Elvis smiled. "I mean, terrible." Even Johnny laughed. But Elvis's smile faded. Still, Samuel never laughed. That sentence changed the room. Johnny's face became still. Elvis continued. "He'd take my hands and move them into position." Elvis looked at his own hands. He'd tell me, "Don't fight the piano." His fingers touched the keys again. "Listen to it." A quiet melody began. "If you force music to come out, people will hear the force." The melody continued. "But if you tell the truth," Elvis's voice dropped almost to a whisper, "people will hear themselves inside it." The audience sat frozen. Johnny's eyes were beginning to shine again. He looked away. Perhaps he didn't want the cameras to see, but the cameras were already there, and millions of people were watching. Elvis continued playing Samuel's melody. At first, Johnny thought it was simply a beautiful piece of music, but now he understood why Elvis had become so emotional. This was not just a song. It was a voice from the past. A man who had been gone for years was somehow still speaking through Elvis's hands. Johnny finally asked, "What happened to him?" Elvis stopped. His face became completely still. The audience seemed to know immediately that the answer would hurt. Elvis looked toward the dark space beyond the cameras. Then he spoke. Life happened. Nobody moved. Samuel got sick. His fingers slowly closed together. And when I left to chase music, Elvis swallowed. I promised him I would come back. Johnny lowered his head. Elvis's voice became quieter. I told him I would come back and play for him. The room was completely silent. And I meant it. A pause. I really meant it. Elvis looked at the piano. But the world got bigger. Johnny closed his eyes. Shows, Elvis continued. Travel, records, movies, crowds, contracts. Everything I used to dream about. His fingers returned to the keys. And somehow, he played one quiet note. I kept telling myself I would go back tomorrow. Another note. Then next week. Another. Then after the next show. Johnny looked toward Elvis. His face was filled with regret. Because now he understood. This was not a story about a piano. It was about the most dangerous word in the world. Tomorrow. Elvis looked toward the audience. Do you know what happens when you keep telling yourself you have time? Nobody answered. He looked down. One day, you find out you were wrong. The room seemed to stop breathing. Elvis closed his eyes. Samuel died before I came back. A woman in the front row began crying. Johnny Carson immediately turned away. Elvis sat motionless. For several seconds he could not continue. Then he whispered, I wasn't there. His voice cracked. The audience remained absolutely silent. I had spent years trying to become somebody. He looked at the piano. And the one person who had believed in me before I was anybody. His voice broke completely. I wasn't there when he needed me. Johnny covered his mouth. Tears filled his eyes. The joke from earlier now seemed impossible, so distant, so small. Elvis slowly raised his hands toward the keys again. After he was gone, I went back to his house. The melody returned, slowly, painfully. The piano was still there. He played the same fragile notes from the beginning. Covered in dust. Johnny stared. Everything was quiet. Elvis continued, and sitting on top of it was a piece of paper. The audience leaned forward. Johnny wiped his eyes. What did it say? Elvis's hands stopped. His answer came softly. Samuel had written a melody. The entire studio became still. Elvis looked at the piano, but he never finished it. Johnny stared at him. Elvis continued. Under the notes, he had written my name. Johnny's mouth opened slightly. The audience gasped. Elvis swallowed. And beneath my name. His fingers trembled above the keys. There were only 7 words. The silence became unbearable. Johnny stepped closer. What were they? Elvis slowly looked up. His eyes were wet. He wrote. A long pause. Finish it when you are ready to remember. The audience broke. People cried openly now. Johnny lowered his head. Elvis turned back to the piano. For years I couldn't play it. His voice was barely audible. I knew the melody. He pressed one key. I remembered every note. Another, but I couldn't finish it. The piano began again. Every time I tried, I remembered that I had promised him. The melody grew, and every time I remembered the promise, his hands moved faster. I remembered that I broke it. Johnny suddenly walked toward the piano. Elvis continued playing. The music was becoming stronger now, more desperate, more alive. Johnny stopped only a few feet away. And then, something happened that nobody expected. Elvis suddenly stopped in the middle of the melody. His hands froze. The audience gasped. Johnny looked at him. Elvis? But Elvis was staring at the keys. His face had changed. The same melody, the same unfinished ending, the same place where he had stopped for years. But tonight, something was different. He looked toward Johnny Carson, and through tears he said, "Johnny." Carson stepped closer. "Yes?" Elvis gave a small, broken smile. "Maybe Samuel was right." Johnny stared at him. "About what?" Elvis looked down at the piano. "Maybe I wasn't ready to remember until tonight." The studio became silent. Johnny's eyes widened. Elvis continued, "Maybe I needed someone to laugh first." Johnny's face collapsed with emotion. He immediately shook his head. "Elvis, But Elvis raised his hand. "No." Johnny stopped. Elvis smiled through his tears. "You didn't hurt me." A pause. "You reminded me." Johnny could no longer hide his tears. The audience was crying with him. Elvis placed both hands over the keys, and for the first time, he moved past the place where the unfinished melody had always ended. Johnny suddenly froze. The audience gasped. A new sequence of notes emerged. Elvis had never played this part before, at least not in front of anyone. The melody rose, softly at first, then with incredible power. Elvis's voice returned, but now he wasn't singing about pain. He was singing through it. Every note seemed to carry the apology he never got to make. Every chord sounded like a memory finally being released. Johnny stood beside the piano, tears running freely down his face. The audience began to rise. Not to applaud, not yet. They were too stunned. They simply stood, listening. And then Elvis reached the final section, the one Samuel had never written, the one Elvis had never been able to complete. His fingers moved, his voice grew. The melody climbed toward something beautiful, something final, something that felt like goodbye. But just as Elvis prepared to play the final chord, a voice suddenly came from the darkness behind the stage. "Stop!" Elvis's hands froze above the keys. Johnny turned around. The audience gasped. A man was standing near the backstage entrance. He was older. His face was pale. And in his hands, he held a small, worn envelope. The man stared directly at Elvis. Then he raised the envelope and said, "Elvis, Samuel told me to give you this only after you finally finished the song." Elvis stopped breathing. Johnny Carson looked at him in shock. The entire studio fell into absolute silence, because whatever was inside that envelope had been waiting for Elvis for years. "Stop!" The word cut through the studio like a sudden clap of thunder. Elvis's hands froze above the piano keys. The final chord never came. Johnny Carson turned sharply toward the backstage entrance. The audience gasped. For one long second, nobody understood what was happening. Then they saw him. An elderly man stood in the shadows near the edge of the stage. His gray coat hung loosely from his shoulders. His face looked pale beneath the harsh studio lights. In one hand, he held a small, worn envelope, and with the other, he pointed directly at Elvis. "Elvis!" His voice trembled. "I've been looking for you." The entire Tonight Show studio fell silent. Elvis slowly stood from the piano bench. His face had lost all color. Johnny looked from the stranger to Elvis. "You know this man?" Elvis stared. For several seconds he couldn't answer. Then, quietly, he whispered, "Thomas?" The old man nodded. A murmur moved through the audience. Elvis took one step forward, then another. "Thomas?" The name seemed to come from somewhere buried deep in his memory. Thomas had once been Samuel's closest friend, a man Elvis remembered from long ago. When Elvis was young, Thomas had often sat quietly in the corner of Samuel's small house, listening to Samuel play the old piano while drinking coffee from a chipped cup. But Elvis had not seen him in years. Too many years. "What are you doing here?" Elvis asked. Thomas looked at the envelope, then back at Elvis. "I heard you were going to be on television tonight." His voice was weak. "So I came." Johnny Carson remained completely still. The cameras kept rolling. Nobody in the control room dared cut away. Something bigger than television was happening now. Thomas slowly raised the envelope. "Samuel gave me this." Elvis stared at it. The envelope was old. Its corners were bent. The paper had turned yellow with time. Thomas continued, "He made me promise." Elvis's eyes narrowed. "Promise what?" Thomas took a slow breath. "He said I wasn't to give it to you until you finished the song." The audience gasped again. Elvis looked back toward the piano, then at Thomas. "But I haven't finished it." Thomas shook his head. "Yes, you have." Elvis's face changed. "No." Thomas stepped closer. "You went beyond the last note tonight." The entire room became silent. Elvis remembered, his hands moving past the place where Samuel's melody had always ended. The new notes. The ones that had seemed to appear from nowhere. The ending he had never been able to find. Thomas looked directly into his eyes. "Samuel was waiting for you to stop being afraid of the last page." Johnny Carson lowered his head. Elvis slowly reached toward the envelope, but before his fingers touched it, he stopped. "What is inside?" Thomas smiled sadly. "Something Samuel thought you would need one day." Elvis took the envelope. His hands were trembling. The audience watched every movement. Johnny Carson walked closer but stopped at a respectful distance. He could see the emotion on Elvis's face. This was no longer about a performance, no longer about proving he could play the piano. A few minutes earlier, Johnny had laughed at Elvis. Now, Johnny was watching a man come face to face with a part of his life he had spent years trying to avoid. Elvis stared at the envelope. His name was written across the front, not printed, written by hand. The handwriting was old-fashioned and uneven, but Elvis recognized it instantly. His lips parted. "Oh, God." The words were barely audible. Thomas nodded. His handwriting. Elvis ran his thumb gently across the faded ink. For years he had probably seen Samuel's handwriting only in memories. Now here it was, real, physical. Something left behind by a man who could no longer speak. Johnny's eyes filled again. Elvis carefully opened the envelope. The sound of the paper seemed unnaturally loud inside the silent studio. There was one folded sheet inside, and something else, a small brass key. Elvis pulled it out first. He stared at it. Thomas watched him. "Do you remember that key?" Elvis slowly shook his head. Thomas smiled. "You will." Elvis unfolded the letter. His eyes moved across the first line. Then he stopped breathing. Johnny could see that whatever Samuel had written, it had already broken through Elvis's defenses. Elvis closed his eyes. Johnny asked quietly, "Would you like to read it privately?" Elvis looked at him. For a moment, everyone thought he might leave the stage. But Elvis shook his head. "No." His voice was unsteady. "I've kept this part of my life quiet for too long." Johnny nodded. The audience remained silent. Elvis looked down at the letter again. Then he began to read. "My dear boy." His voice broke after the first words. He stopped, took a breath, and tried again. "My dear boy, if Thomas is giving you this letter, then you finally finished the song." The audience listened without moving. Elvis continued, "And if you finished it, that means you finally forgave yourself." Johnny closed his eyes. Elvis stopped reading. His face tightened. The letter shook in his hands. Thomas looked down. He had clearly heard these words before. Or perhaps Samuel had told him what he hoped the letter would mean. Elvis swallowed hard and continued, "You will spend many years believing you failed me because you did not come back." A tear ran down Elvis's face. "But listen to me carefully." The studio was so silent that nobody could even hear a chair move. "You did not fail me." Elvis lowered the letter. His shoulders began to shake. Johnny whispered, "Elvis." But Elvis raised one hand. He needed to continue. He looked back at the paper. "I watched you leave because I knew you had somewhere to go." The audience's eyes filled with tears. "I never taught you music so you would stay beside my old piano forever." Elvis's voice became softer. "I taught you music so one day you could carry it farther than I ever could." The audience began crying openly. Johnny turned away. He pressed his fingers against his eyes. Elvis read on, "One day you will become so busy that you will blame yourself for not coming back sooner." A pause. "And when that day comes, remember this." Elvis could barely speak the next line. "A promise is not always broken because someone forgets." He looked toward the audience. Sometimes life takes us farther than our hearts planned to travel. Johnny stared at him. Elvis's eyes were filled with tears. "But if you ever remember me when you play," his voice softened, "then, my boy, you came back." The letter slipped slightly in Elvis's hands. Johnny could no longer hold back. Tears rolled down his face. He turned toward the audience, but there was no hiding it now. The audience was crying too. Elvis read the next line, "And please don't spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for giving the world the gift I always knew you had." The studio seemed to collapse beneath the weight of those words. Elvis looked at Thomas. "Why didn't you give this to me?" Thomas's face twisted with pain. "I tried." Elvis stared. Thomas took a step closer. "I tried more than once." Johnny watched carefully. Thomas continued, "After Samuel died, I went looking for you." Elvis's face changed. "I didn't know." "I know," Thomas nodded. "You were traveling, recording, working. His eyes lowered. Everywhere I went, they told me the same thing. He looked toward the cameras. Too busy. Elvis closed his eyes. Thomas's voice became stronger. I told myself I would find you after the next show. Elvis suddenly looked at him. The words struck him like a blow. Tomorrow. After the next show. The same excuse. Thomas nodded as if he understood. Yes. His eyes filled. And then 1 year became another. Elvis slowly looked down. Thomas continued, I carried this envelope for longer than I should have. He touched his chest. Because I made the same mistake you did. Nobody spoke. Elvis looked at the letter again, then at Thomas. You were afraid. Thomas nodded. I was ashamed. The two men stood facing one another, separated by years, by silence, by regret, and by one promise that neither of them had known how to release. Elvis slowly walked toward him. Thomas looked nervous. Then Elvis opened his arms. The old man froze, and Elvis embraced him. The audience erupted into tears. Johnny Carson covered his face. The applause began softly, but it was not the loud applause of a television show. It was the sound of hundreds of people responding to something human, something real. Elvis held Thomas tightly, then whispered, You should have come sooner. Thomas laughed through tears. So should you. Elvis stepped back. For the first time that night, he laughed. A real laugh. Small, broken, but real. Then Thomas pointed toward the brass key still resting in Elvis's hand. You still don't remember, do you? Elvis looked down. No. Thomas smiled. Samuel's piano. Elvis stared. Thomas continued. That key opens the bottom drawer. The audience murmured. Elvis's face changed again. Thomas reached into his coat and removed an old photograph. He handed it to Elvis. The photograph showed Samuel beside his battered upright piano. A much younger Elvis sat nearby. Elvis stared at the image. Then he noticed something. A small drawer beneath the keyboard. He looked at the brass key. Thomas nodded. Samuel kept something there. Elvis whispered, What? Thomas smiled. I never knew. The audience leaned forward. He locked it years before he got sick. Elvis looked at him. And he never told you? Thomas shook his head. No. Then why give me the key? Thomas's eyes became wet again. Because on the day he died, Samuel looked at me and said something strange. Elvis waited. Thomas took a breath. He said, When my boy is finally ready to finish the song, he'll know where to find the rest of it. Johnny Carson stared at Elvis. The audience gasped. Elvis slowly turned toward the piano on the Tonight Show stage, then back toward the brass key. What rest of it? Thomas shook his head. I don't know. Elvis looked at Samuel's letter. There was still more writing beneath the last line. He had been too emotional to notice. His eyes moved downward. Then his face suddenly froze. Johnny saw it. What is it? Elvis didn't answer. He stared at the paper. Johnny stepped closer. Elvis? Finally, Elvis spoke. There is one more message. The entire studio became silent again. Thomas looked shocked. What does it say? Elvis's eyes moved across the final line. Then he slowly looked up. And what he read next changed everything. Go home. Johnny's face tightened. Elvis continued reading. The song you played tonight was never the song I wrote for you. Nobody moved. Thomas stared in disbelief. Elvis's hands began shaking again. There is another song. The audience gasped. Elvis looked at the piano, then at the small brass key, and finally at Thomas. Samuel had known all these years. The melody Elvis believed was unfinished had only been the beginning. The real song was still waiting, locked inside an old piano drawer, in a house filled with memories, waiting for the boy Samuel once knew to finally come home. Johnny Carson slowly walked toward Elvis. "What are you going to do?" Elvis looked down at the key. His answer came without hesitation. "I'm going home." The audience rose to its feet. But nobody knew that Elvis's journey home would reveal something even more heartbreaking. Because inside that old piano, Elvis would discover why Samuel had made him wait all these years, and what Johnny Carson would see when Elvis finally opened that locked drawer would make the famous host cry harder than he had all night. The audience was still standing when Elvis Presley walked away from the piano. But nobody was applauding now, not because they were unimpressed, because the moment had become too real for applause. Elvis stood beneath the Tonight Show lights with Samuel's old letter in one hand and the small brass key in the other. Johnny Carson stared at him. Thomas stood beside the stage, and for the first time that night, the entire studio seemed to understand that the performance had never truly been the story. The real story had been waiting somewhere else. In an old house, inside a forgotten piano, behind a locked drawer. Elvis looked at Johnny. "I have to go." Johnny nodded slowly. Nobody expected him to argue. But then Johnny stepped closer. "Then go." Elvis looked at him. Johnny's eyes were still wet. "Go finish what you started." The audience remained silent. Elvis looked down at the brass key. "I don't know what's waiting for me." Johnny gave a broken smile. "Maybe that's the point." Elvis nodded. Then he turned toward Thomas. "Will you come with me?" Thomas froze. For years he had carried Samuel's letter. For years he had lived with the same regret. And now Elvis was asking him to return to the place neither of them had been able to face. Thomas looked toward the floor, then slowly nodded. Yes. Johnny looked at them both. And suddenly, he took off his microphone. A producer rushed forward. "Johnny, we're still live." Carson ignored him. He looked at Elvis. "I think I'm coming too." The audience gasped. Elvis stared at him. "Johnny." Carson shook his head. "You sat down at that piano because of something I said." He swallowed hard. "Maybe I need to see where that song began." The producer looked horrified. The cameras were still broadcasting. Millions were watching. The show had become something no schedule could contain. But Johnny Carson simply turned toward the nearest camera. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice was quiet. The studio listened. "I think tonight's show just changed." Then he looked toward Elvis. "Let's go home." The audience erupted, not with laughter, with applause. Deep, emotional, thunderous. And as the cameras continued rolling, Elvis, Johnny, and Thomas walked away from the Tonight Show stage. Behind them stood the black grand piano, the instrument that had started as a joke, the instrument Johnny had claimed Elvis could never play. Now it remained alone beneath the lights, silent, as if even it knew. The night was not over. The drive felt longer than anyone expected. Thomas sat beside Elvis. Johnny sat quietly nearby. For most of the journey, nobody spoke. Outside the windows, the city lights slowly disappeared. The roads grew darker. The world became quieter. Elvis held Samuel's letter in his lap. Every few minutes, he looked at the brass key. Finally, Johnny broke the silence. "Were you afraid to come back?" Elvis looked through the window. "Yes." Johnny waited. Elvis continued, "I thought if I stayed away, I could remember Samuel the way I wanted to remember him." Thomas lowered his eyes. "And how was that?" Elvis smiled sadly. "Alive." Nobody spoke. Then Elvis looked toward Johnny. "But memories don't stay where you leave them." Johnny nodded. "They follow you." Elvis looked down. "Exactly." Thomas stared at the road ahead. "I came here once after Samuel died." Elvis turned. "You did?" Thomas nodded. "I stood outside the house." A pause. "But I couldn't go in." "Why?" Thomas's voice became weak. "Because I thought if I opened that door, I would have to accept he wasn't coming back." Johnny looked at him. "And tonight?" Thomas gave a small smile. "Tonight, I learned something." Elvis waited. Thomas looked toward the darkness beyond the window. "Accepting someone is gone doesn't mean you stop carrying what they gave you." Elvis looked down at Samuel's letter. The words seemed to settle deep inside him. When they finally arrived, nobody moved at first. The house stood quietly beneath the night sky. It was smaller than Elvis remembered, older. The paint was faded, the porch looked tired, and the windows reflected nothing except darkness. Elvis stared at it. For a moment, he was no longer the biggest star in the world. He was a young boy again, standing outside Samuel's home, waiting to hear the old piano through an open window. Thomas stepped out of the car. Johnny followed. Elvis remained inside. Johnny looked back. "You coming?" Elvis stared at the front door. His voice was barely audible. "I don't know if I can." Johnny walked closer to the car. Only minutes earlier, he had been the man who laughed. Now, he was the one offering his hand. "You don't have to prove anything tonight." Elvis looked at him. Johnny continued, "Not to me, not to Thomas, not to anyone." A pause. "Just open the door." Elvis looked toward the house again, then slowly stepped out. The front door groaned when Thomas pushed it open. A wave of old air moved through the darkness. Nobody spoke. The house was exactly as Elvis remembered, and completely different. Dust covered the furniture. Old photographs remained on the walls. A clock stood frozen, as though time itself had entered the house years ago and decided not to leave. Elvis walked slowly through the hallway. His fingers touched the wall. A memory returned. Samuel laughing, a cup falling, someone playing the wrong note. Elvis smiled. Then his smile disappeared, because beneath all the memories was one painful truth. He had stayed away too long. Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder. "He knew you would come back." Elvis shook his head. "No." Thomas looked at him. Elvis raised Samuel's letter. "He hoped I would." The words hit harder, because hope was more fragile than certainty. And Samuel had waited with hope, not knowing if Elvis would ever return. Johnny watched quietly. Then Thomas pointed toward the next room. Elvis. At the far end of the hallway, the piano waited, the old upright piano. Dust covered its wooden surface. The same scratches Elvis remembered were still there, the same worn keys, the same cracked corner. For several seconds, Elvis could not move. Then he slowly walked forward, one step, then another. Johnny followed at a distance. Elvis reached the piano. He touched it, and his eyes immediately filled with tears. "He's gone." Johnny stood behind him. "Yes." Elvis lowered his head. "But this is still here." Thomas smiled. "Maybe Samuel knew you needed something to remind you." Elvis looked at the brass key. He knelt beside the piano and found the small drawer beneath the keyboard. For a moment, he simply stared at the lock. Johnny's breathing slowed. Thomas stepped closer. Elvis inserted the key. It didn't move. He tried again, still nothing. His hands were shaking too badly. Johnny knelt beside him. "Here." Elvis looked at him. Johnny gently placed his hand over Elvis's. "Together." Elvis gave a faint smile, then turned the key. Click. The sound echoed through the silent house. Nobody moved. Elvis slowly pulled the drawer open. Inside, there was a stack of yellowed paper, a photograph, and a small object wrapped in cloth. Elvis stared. Thomas whispered, "Oh, my God." Johnny leaned closer. Elvis picked up the photograph first. It showed a young Elvis sitting at the piano. Samuel stood behind him. Both were laughing. But written beneath the picture were words Elvis had never seen before. In Samuel's handwriting, "The boy doesn't know it yet, but one day the world will listen." Elvis pressed the photograph against his chest. Johnny turned away. His eyes filled again. But there was still the paper. Elvis unfolded it. Music. Lines of handwritten notes. An entire song. Not a melody. Not an unfinished idea. A complete piece. At the top, Samuel had written, "For Elvis, play this only when you understand why music matters." Elvis stared at the words. Thomas whispered, "He finished it." Johnny looked at Elvis. "Can you play it?" Elvis sat down. The old piano bench creaked beneath him. He placed the pages carefully in front of him. Then his hands moved above the keys. For several seconds, nothing happened. Elvis closed his eyes. Johnny waited. Thomas waited. The old house waited. Then Elvis pressed the first key. The piano sounded imperfect, old, worn, beautiful. The melody filled the empty room, and instantly, Elvis began to cry. He didn't stop playing, but tears ran down his face as Samuel's music came alive. The song was simple. Nothing like the enormous productions Elvis had performed before thousands of people. It didn't need to be. Every note sounded like home. Johnny stood silently in the corner. He remembered the joke. He remembered telling Elvis that he would never play. And now he understood how little he had known. Elvis wasn't great because he could impress an audience. He was great because he could sit in an empty room, touch an old piano, and make someone who had never met Samuel feel his presence. Then Elvis began to sing. His voice was soft. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. They spoke about dreams, about leaving, about returning too late, about people who teach us how to become ourselves, then disappear before we learn how to thank them. Thomas began crying. Johnny did too. But Elvis continued. The song moved toward its final section. And then something happened. Elvis stopped. He looked at the music. One final page was missing. Thomas stepped forward. "No." Elvis looked again. The last page was gone. Johnny searched the drawer. Nothing. Elvis's face fell. "It's not here." Thomas began looking around. The floor, the piano, the room. Nothing. Then Johnny noticed the cloth-wrapped object. Elvis. Elvis looked. Slowly, he opened it. Inside was a small cassette tape, and beneath it was one final note. Elvis unfolded it. His hands trembled. The message was short. "If you want to hear the ending, listen." Nobody spoke. Thomas looked toward an old tape player sitting on a shelf. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Elvis walked toward it. He carefully inserted the tape. Johnny and Thomas stood beside him. Elvis pressed play. Static. A crackling sound. Then a piano. Samuel, playing the final part of the song. The melody was weak because of the old recording, but everyone could hear it. And then Samuel's voice entered, older, rougher, but full of warmth. Elvis covered his mouth. Samuel was speaking. "If you're hearing this, my boy." Elvis closed his eyes. "I didn't live long enough to hear you play the ending." A tear rolled down Elvis's face. "But I never needed to." Johnny's eyes filled again. Samuel continued, "I knew you would find it." Elvis lowered his head. "Not because you're talented." A pause. "Because you care." The old tape crackled. And then Samuel said the words Elvis would remember forever. "Music isn't important because it makes people applaud." Johnny Carson began crying again. Samuel's voice continued. "Music matters because sometimes a person carries something too heavy to say." Elvis looked toward the piano. "And when words fail," the recording paused beneath the crackle of time, "a song can carry it for them." The tape ended. Click. Silence. Absolute silence. Nobody spoke. Elvis walked back to the piano. This time, he didn't need the missing page. He didn't need the notes. He didn't need to be taught. He sat down, placed his hands on the keys, and finished the song. Not Samuel's ending, his own. The melody rose through the old house. Johnny closed his eyes. Thomas placed a hand over his heart. Elvis sang. And every note seemed to carry all the years between the young boy who had first touched those keys and the man who had finally returned home. When he played the final chord, he did not stop immediately. His hands rested on the piano. His eyes remained closed. Then he whispered, "I came back." Thomas began crying. Johnny walked toward Elvis. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Finally, he placed a hand on Elvis's shoulder. "I was wrong." Elvis looked up. Johnny smiled through tears. "Not just about the piano." Elvis waited. Johnny looked around the old room. "I thought talent was something you prove." He shook his head. "But tonight I learned something." Elvis listened. Johnny said, "The greatest artists don't prove what they can do." He pointed toward Elvis's heart. "They reveal what they survived." Elvis's eyes filled again. The two men stood in silence. Then Elvis smiled. "You know, Johnny," Carson looked at him. "You were right about one thing." Johnny looked nervous. Elvis laughed softly. "What?" "I couldn't play that piano if my life depended on it." Johnny stared. Elvis looked toward Samuel's old piano, then back at him. "But maybe I could play it because someone else's life once believed I could." Johnny couldn't hold back. He embraced Elvis. And this time, there were no cameras around them, no studio audience, no applause, only an old piano, a finished song, and 3 men who had finally learned the same lesson. You do not always get another tomorrow. You do not always get another chance to say thank you. But if someone gave you love, if someone believed in you, if someone helped you become the person you are, you can honor them now. Not someday. Not after the next show. Not when life finally becomes less busy. Now. Because sometimes, the people we miss the most are not asking us to spend our lives drowning in regret. They are asking us to keep living, to keep singing, to finish the song. And somewhere in the darkness of that old house, Elvis looked toward the piano one final time. Then he smiled. The next night, when Johnny Carson returned to his desk, he looked directly into the camera. His voice was quiet, but millions listened. Last night, I laughed at a man and told him he would never play the piano. He paused. I was wrong. The studio was silent. Johnny looked toward Elvis sitting nearby. And sometimes being wrong is the best thing that can happen to you. Elvis smiled. Johnny continued, because it means you still have something to learn. Then Johnny looked into the camera. And what I learned from Elvis Presley is this. He paused. Never laugh at the dream you don't understand. Another pause. Never mistake silence for weakness. Then Johnny looked toward Elvis. And never assume you know what someone carries inside their heart until you hear their song. The audience rose to its feet. Elvis looked toward the piano, not with sadness this time, but with peace, because Samuel's song was finally finished. And so was the promise Elvis had spent years believing he had broken. That night, Johnny Carson cried. Elvis cried. The audience cried. But in the end, the tears were no longer about regret. They were about remembering. Because sometimes, the greatest answer to laughter is not anger. It is not an argument. It is not revenge. Sometimes, you simply sit down, place your hands on the keys, and let everything you survived become music. The people who doubt you may forget what they said, but the work you do in silence can one day speak louder than every laugh they ever made. And sometimes, the most beautiful song of your life is the one you almost never had the courage to finish.